A little bit about Colombia. First of all, I think it is known pretty much worldwide as a culture of violence. Much as ours, I see, is a culture of violence. Theirs, in many ways, is quite similar to ours. The local newspapers, are filled every day with stories of murders, as ours are. And it's a nation of victims. I heard a presentation. It has the worst human rights record in Latin America. It has about 40 million people. It's a big, big country. I mean, you can see, just geographically, you can see by all the mountain ranges and the rivers and the geography how divided up it is and how difficult it is to move very far in that country. More than 5 million people are internally displaced. A quarter have lost a family member in the violence in some way. 20% have experienced displacement in their family. 5% have experienced at least one person exiled. So in the last 30 years, approximately 13 million acres, a lot of that good land, very good land, has been transferred, stolen, whatever you want to say. People have been moved from that land and others have taken that land, started something on it. So the question is who and why? And it turns out that a majority of these 13 million acres now are in the hands of large landowners, large farmers and ranchers, and multinational corporations. I haven't yet said a word about drug trafficking. Of course it's big. It's very big. But it's not the root cause of this displacement problem. It's how it's funded. It's how military groups, armed armies, private armies, public armies, are funded. But it's not the root cause. The armed conflict has been going on for decades. There is primarily now just one guerrilla movement. There used to be a number of guerrilla groups. Now it's down to pretty much one, with maybe 4,000 armed members. There is the huge growth of paramilitary groups, private armies. These are the ones that concern me the very most because they're not accountable to anybody. All of these large corporate and agriculture entities have their own armies, their own paramilitaries. And of course they are well armed, they are trained. And one of the things and this is the thing that I heard the most concern about, when Colombian people lower their voices to talk about some of these issues, it's not about the drug trafficking, it's not about these other things, it's about the paramilitaries. In any society where there is such huge disparity of wealth, and we see it coming here too now, more and more people are involved in security. More and more men, especially, are involved in some kind of security work, because that's about all they can get. The guerrilla movement, which started 50 years ago, I think it's largely survived partly because of the money from drug trafficking. They've benefited from that, become part of that. But also because of the geography. There's, they can go into the mountains, they can go into these these places that are very hard to get to, and they can be really hard to reach. And then the military. The military, and this is where our government has gotten involved because we are a big supporter of the Colombian military. The one other thing I would say about the paramilitaries is, and this people are very concerned about, they are beginning to have a lot of influence on government, Colombian government, at all levels, right down to the local level. The church the Presbyterian Church of Columbia is very involved in supporting some displaced people start a tomato growing project, very large tomato growing project that employs about 6 to 10 families of displaced people. Well, it so happens that the mayor of the town closest to this tomato project it was his land that they're using. He actually rented or gave these farmers this land, but it turns out, is involved with paramilitaries. So the church, even in working with these displaced people in this tomato project, is now trying to sort out their involvement with paramilitaries. Let me tell you about worship at this one in Cartagena that I mentioned. It's just as some of you have seen these little, it's like a storefront church, just one big room in a poor neighborhood. And it's interesting. They always have more people in worship than they do members. The opposite of us. This one Sunday, the pastor, a woman named Angelica, we happened to be there on International Women's Day. And she said, we are going to celebrate International Women's Day today in worship. So what does she do? She calls up each woman in the congregation, and there weren't as many as in ours, for example, but there probably were 25 or 30. She called them up one at a time, young girls through very elderly people. She presented them to the congregation, introduced each one at a time to the congregation, and said, these are all the ways this woman blesses our congregation. Oh. It was so moving. It was so moving and so intimate to experience that in worship. And then each one was presented with this little handmade card that someone had made. And they ran out of cards. But nobody cared, because she said, we'll have more next week, don't worry. And so they have really strong churches, very strong churches, and churches that are not just focused on themselves. Here they are celebrating International Women's Day. They were in solidarity with women of the world. Their accompaniment program is primarily placing accompaniers in the churches, and just be in this church community for a week or two, and whatever they ask you to do, do it. 6 years ago, this is an interesting connection with us. There's a leader in the Presbyterian Church named Rick Ufford Chase. Some of you may have heard the name. He is the founder of Border Links. Border Links on the Arizona-Mexican border, where our youth went for their program, their mission trip last summer, and had a very powerful experience with Border Links. And I think they learned a lot about accompaniment in that experience, I'm guessing. Rick Ufford Chase started Border Links 20-some years ago. When he was, soon after he became moderator, he found on his, this is his story, he found on his desk, or somewhere, this letter from the Presbyterian Church of Columbia asking for help. They were being targeted because of their human rights work with the Catholics. With the Catholics, they had started a human rights center to respond to displaced people. And by doing that, they became targeted as enemies of the state. And one of their pastors, who I met, was receiving death threats. He was very involved in this human rights center. He was receiving death threats, and the church said, we can't do this on our own. We're going to get, what everybody else has been getting. And so the church sent this letter to the Presbyterian Church USA. Rick Ufford Chase finds the letter, and he says, what are we going to do about this request? They're asking us to send accompaniers to be with them in this danger. And so Rick took it to his governing council of our church, and as the story goes, some of them said, oh, we can't do it. It would cost too much money. And so Rick and others said, well, okay, then we'll do it with volunteers. And what they do, it's just a very simple program. But I don't know if we haven't heard much about this, but within the Presbyterian Church, there is a pacifist movement. We have a group in the Presbyterian Church, but in the Presbyterian Church it's very active, and it's called the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. So they're pacifists in the Presbyterian Church, and they said, well, if our larger church doesn't want to deal with this request, we will. And our pacifist group, Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, took it on and developed this program called the Accompanying Program in Columbia. They only send 2 people a month. In just they have 2 training retreats. They're very interesting. They're called Discernment Training Intensive Weekends. And if a person is interested, I went last October. You go to this retreat for like 4 to 5 days, and with about maybe a dozen people, Presbyterians or others who are interested, and you go through, and at the end of this training, learning a lot about accompaniment, about nonviolence, and about the church in Colombia and these issues in Colombia, then they sit down with each person one by one and say, well, and it's a mutual decision. They might say, based on our observation of you this weekend, I'm not sure if this is a good fit. Or they might say, would you like to move forward and be an accompaniment? And my partner, who I didn't know, I didn't even meet till I got there, was a Mennonite woman from Goshen, Indiana. But some people come who don't even have Spanish. And I really admire them because they're taking on a whole other dimension of difficulty.